Welcome back, everyone. Well, about a month ago, my 17-year-old daughter introduced me to Philomena Cunk. She's a character played by an actress named Diane Morgan, who purports to be a investigative historian, kind of trying to tell a story, kind of narrating a documentary, and she's interviewing all these prominent historians and telling stories from history. And it's all a spoof. It's all like a farce. And I'm pretty sure the people she's interviewing are in on the joke, but they don't necessarily know what she's going to say. And it's absolutely hilarious stuff. So I thought I would dive into where she talks about World War I and just do a reaction to it. I saw my friend Mr. Terry did a reaction to her the other day, and it seems like it was very popular. So thought it would be fun. There's so much content out there that she's got. She's got a series on Netflix right now, which is hilarious. But I wanted to go into something that I was interested in that I knew a little something about. So this is from her episode 4 from her series on Britain. And it's called 20th Century Shocks. And it's going to begin with World War I. So I thought we'd watch, have a little fun. I'll try to decipher the real history from what she's saying, and it'll be interesting. I'll put the link in the description to the original content if you want to check it out and watch all the rest of it. But if you just look for Philomena Cunk, you'll find all kinds of stuff on Netflix, on YouTube.
Nowadays, first world is something you put in front of the word problem to show that it isn't really that bad, like running out of couscous or not being able to check Twitter in a tunnel. But back then,
not being able to check Twitter in a tunnel. First world problems, that's right.
First world was what they called the war. The First World War had loads of nicknames. The War to End All Wars, the Great War, and of course, World War One. Why did they call World War One World War One? It's quite pessimistic numbering, isn't it? Or did they just know it was the start of a franchise?
Did they know it was the start of a franchise? Well, of course, it wasn't called World War I at the time. It was called typically the Great War, or the War to End All Wars was kind of a nickname that they used for it, but usually the Great War.
At the time, they weren't numbering the wars, although I think that in the First World War, the idea of it being a great war, denoting the sheer scale of the conflict, the casualty rate, was already becoming used quite a lot.
And what I love about this is that you've got these real historians who are kind of the straight man to her comedy, and she just rolls with it. It's really so good.
So it was called the Great War, but not because it was great. The First World War was started by the killing of one man, Franz Ferdinand. You've probably never heard of him, or the band named after him.
Or the band. I knew she was going to go down the road of mentioning the band.
But he was dead important. By which I mean he was only important when he was dead. His assassination triggered a series of other killings. Soon it caught on, and everyone wanted to be killed.
Soon it caught on, and everyone wanted to be killed. This is the Imperial War Museum, which I was going to go to when I was in London the last time, but I didn't get a chance to get up there, but I definitely plan to. I've heard great things about it.
It was a bigger craze than fidget spinners. Eventually, Britain got sucked into the fighting, and men queued up to have their flat caps converted into fighting men's helmets. Soon, hundreds of thousands of Tommies were heading for battle.
So remember this time, I know I'm being serious with history, but we're going to have a good laugh too. Britain has a very small professional army, and they're one of the last major powers to actually institute any kind of a draft. So for a long time, the British Army tried to do everything through volunteers, and so they raised these PALS battalions where you could sign up with your friends from your town or from where you work. And of course, that was a nightmare because if a battalion got wiped out at a place like the Somme or Ypres, pretty soon everybody from your town or everybody from your workplace is dead. But they also had this thing that they would do that was really clever and really just horrible at the same time, where women out on the street, if they saw a man who appeared to be of fighting age, but he wasn't in uniform, they would hand him a white feather, and it was a way of calling them a coward for not doing their part. And a lot of like young men who were like 15, 16 years old, who were too young to even be in the army, would get shamed into enlisting because somebody handed them a white feather.
Why were all the British soldiers in World War I called Tommy? Was that just a coincidence?
No, it wasn't a coincidence. It's just a general name that became applied to British soldiers, in the same way we talk of Fritz as being a generic name for German soldiers.
He was called Fritz. They called him the Bosch a lot, and eventually Jerry was a name that was used, especially in World War II, to refer to the Germans.
What happened in Norman's Land? Were only people that were called Norman allowed in there?
Norman's Land?
It's not Norman's Land. This is no man's land. And the idea being that this is particularly dangerous territory between the lines of the Germans on one side and the British on the other. This is essentially just a killing zone, a very dangerous zone in between trench systems.
Why did they fire shells at each other? Because shells wouldn't really hurt, would they? Unless they were those razor clam shells, because they're quite sharp, aren't they?
Why would they fire shells at each other?
These weren't seashells, these were heavy pieces of ordnance.
He's doing
We're
his
actually
best.
talking about bits of metal in brass casing, so that's where the name shells comes from.
All right.
Looking at footage from the time, it's hard to get a grip on just how brutal it must have been for Tommy and Norman.
Tommy and Norman. So you have to understand, most of the time when you see footage or photos of action in World War II, it's a recreation. There are a few examples. Like there's this very famous photo of a French soldier in the middle of being hit and going down. It's not real. It's a recreation. There are a few examples of real combat footage. For example, Jeffrey Maylands shot some footage of men fighting in the area around the Hawthorne Ridge Redoubt at the Somme on July 1st, 1916. But almost all the footage you see of actual combat is going to be a recreation.
Because it's in black and white and everyone's moving too fast, probably to avoid the shells. Even though it looks a bit like Charlie Chaplin, it's actually not funny at all. So you can't laugh, just like with Charlie Chaplin.
One man who vividly captured the sheer horror of War I was the poet Wilfred Owen.
If, in some smothering dreams, you too could pace behind the wagon that we flung him in, and watch the white eyes writhing in his face, his hanging face like a devil sick of sin. If you could hear at every jolt the blood come gargling from the froth-corrupted lungs, obscene as cancer, bitter as the cud of vile, incurable sores on innocent tongues.
So, one of the great things about World War I is the amount of incredible writing that comes out of the war. Poetry. Men who were on the front lines who, before the war, would not have considered themselves to be authors or writers of any kind, wrote some incredible poetry, and it happened on both sides. Men kept diaries, men did writing, they published this stuff. It was a way of dealing with what was otherwise just an impossibly horrible situation.
You get the gist.
My friend.
You get the
As
gist.
if the killing wasn't bad enough, the accommodation was scarcely worth 2 stars on TripAdvisor. Soldiers had to live in trenches, snaking cramped corridors of filth and squalor, without so much as a patio. The World War I trenches weren't the right place for conventional warfare, were they? But why did neither side think about mud wrestling? Because they're the perfect conditions, aren't they?
Why didn't they think about mud wrestling instead? Now, I will say this. While there were situations where I'm trying my best to enjoy the humor, but also try and tie it back to real history. While there were examples of men being in these trenches for a long period of time, especially during attacks and things like that, the typical system was for them to rotate. And so you had a series of trenches. You had a frontline trench, you had support trenches, things like that, communication trenches between them. Men would spend a couple of days. Each army did it differently, a couple of days on the front lines, and then they'd be rotated off, and then a different group would take their place. So at any given point, only maybe 20%, 30% of your actual force in a given area is on the frontline trench.
Aren't they?
Well, I mean, trench warfare wasn't new. I
No.
think that whilst you will get the occasional game of Christmas football, I don't think that anyone actually ever thought that letting the guns fall silent and having mud wrestling competitions was ever going to sort anything out.
Yeah, trench warfare goes back centuries, even maybe more than that. It was just the scale of trench warfare that happened and the length of time that it existed for.
You missed a trick, don't you? Eventually the war ended at 11 o'clock on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month in the year 1119, 1118, hence the term stopping for 11s. The soldiers came home to a Britain they could hardly recognise because it was wearing a skirt. While the Tommies
Because it was wearing a skirt. Implying that women were doing a lot of the work while the men were on the front lines, which is totally true.
the front, women had stepped into their old jobs. There were women milkmen, women postmen, women bus driver men, even women male prostitutes. What's more,
Women male prostitutes. Okay.
economy was in a pickle. After the war, many industries found it almost impossible to sell their goods abroad because abroad was mainly rubble. There were strikes and marches and a Great Depression. Things were shithouse bad. People needed escapism, but luckily for them, the age of mass entertainment was just beginning. It was the roaring 20s. City streets were full of jazz clubs, packed with Jeeveses and Worcesters, and women with Lego haircuts dancing like they were surprised while shitting their pants at a fancy dress party. And people who couldn't afford to enjoy a roaring 20s for themselves could still watch films of other people doing it at the newly invented cinema. The cinema was a cross between YouTube and theatre. Despite this, it was popular. And
It was a cross between YouTube and theater, and despite this, it was popular. Great point, though. Think about the men who survived this war, and they come back, and now you have the Roaring 20s, and you have like all of this new technology of the theaters becoming a big thing with movies, motion pictures. They had existed already, but and then you're going to get into television coming about in 1930s and 40s. Boy, what a time to be alive. And then, of course, your sons are going to go back and fight the Second World War.
people queued to get in. They showed Charlie Chaplin films, but even that couldn't keep them away. The whole country went films bonkers.
Poor Charlie Chaplin. She's really digging on him, man. First talking about them not being funny, but then saying how people would come even though it was a Charlie Chaplin film.
Going to the cinema in those days was more like going to a book, because there was no sound. The story was explained by words on the screen. A bit like spoilers, but happening at the same time as you were watching it, so not as annoying. And if you couldn't make it to a cinema or cocktail bar, you could still enjoy the jazz age, because scientists had worked out a way to force jazz into your house using a magic called radio.
To force jazz into your house.
Radio was an exciting new invention that made it possible to hear other people's voices in your living room without the use of thin walls or a devastating mental condition. To help keep the early airwaves in check, the government created something called the British Broadcasting Corporation.
BBC.
The BBC. How come the BBC started with radio? Because radio's loads less popular than television, isn't it?
There are people in radio who'd get very angry about that. Radio still performs tremendously well.
There's still radio.
There is still radio.
There's still
At
radio.
the time the BBC was set up, there wasn't a choice because there was no TV.
Luckily, a man called John Logie Baird was about to give birth to television. Not literally out of his vagina.
Not literally out of his vagina. And like a lot of inventions, the television is not going to be the work of one single person, right? A lot of these inventions, take photography, for example, back in the early 19th century. There are a number of people in different places that are working on similar things, and different people are going to make breakthroughs that are going to help everybody's research, and then somebody's going to make that big breakthrough that really makes it happen, and they're the ones we typically get credit for. The Wright brothers were not the first people to work on heavier than air flight. They were just the ones who took all of that work that had been done by many people over the years and were able to perfect it and make it happen.
But metaphorically, out of his shed. After doing some weird experiments like something out of Wallace and Gromit, Baird's TV was finalised, although idiotically, he'd gone to the trouble of inventing it without checking whether there were any programmes on yet. It took a while before there was anything worth putting your iPhone down for. The earliest transmissions looked like Abraham Lincoln looming through a glass door and weren't very exciting. Luckily, it was a short step from there to the BBC's first Saturday night extravaganza, TV's opening night ceremony.
Vision and sound are on. The station goes on the air.
How awesome would that have been?
A mighty maze of mystic magic rays.
The show got a record audience of 400, the sort of viewing figures BBC4 still dreams of.
They got 400 people and BBC 4 still dreams of that.
Despite its popularity, the BBC was causing controversy from the start, and the powers that be were suspicious of it. Why did the government start the BBC in the first place? It seems like these days they're always trying to close it down. Was it one of those stupid mistakes they made, like Brexit?
The government didn't strictly start the BBC. The BBC was originally a private company in 1922. It employed a rather fierce Scottish guy called John Reith. And people still talk about Reithian values and Reithian broadcasting. Reithian values were to inform, educate, and entertain.
What, all at the same time?
Yeah.
Since those early days of black and white tat, the BBC has grown throughout the years to become one of the biggest programme shitting machines in the world, making groundbreaking, iconic programmes which still try to inform, educate or entertain.
Doctor Who.
So the BBC is supposed to inform, educate or entertain.
And entertain.
I'm going to list some BBC things and I want you to say whether they inform, educate or entertain. Okay. News at 10.
Inform.
Open University.
Educate.
Doctor Who.
Entertain.
Strictly Come Dancing.
Entertain.
Holmes Under the Hammer.
Entertain.
Inspector Phillips.
What is Inspector
He
Phillips?
doesn't know that one.
I made that one up.
I made that one up.
Okay, well, it didn't work.
Sounds real though, doesn't it? Inspector Phillips.
No, I instantly knew that it wasn't a real one.
Eat Well for Less. It's where Greg Wallace and another man see how much a family spend on a week's shopping and then criticise them. Make them eat porridge from Lidl.
Inform.
Well done.
Well
Sorry,
done.
I wasn't totting up the scores.
Thank you.
But this golden future of television would have to wait, because back in 1939 times, the TV signals were suddenly switched off, because someone decided to start another war to end all wars. When he became leader of Germany, Adolf Hitler was a funny-looking character with silly hair, a bit like Boris Johnson, but he turned out to be a hateful maniac who would let nothing get in the way of his ambition, a bit like Boris Johnson.
I knew that was coming. Boris Johnson, by the way, born in the United States.
Hitler believed the Germans were an elite race, like the Grand Prix. He also thought
An elite race like the Grand Prix. Nice.
in Poland, and when he went round there to get it back, Britain cried war.
This country is at war with Germany.
Luckily, Britain had a hero on its side, a man whose name will never be forgotten, Winston Churchill.
A man whose name will never be forgotten, proceeds to say the name wrong. I love it.
Churchill's speeches were stirring and powerfully erotic.
We know it will be hard. We expect it will be long.
He was one of the greatest orators of all time, and some of the phrases he used still resonate today, such as finest hour, never surrender, and of course, we shall fight them bitches. And we needed Churchill's stirring mumbling, because at first the war didn't go well. Within 6 months, France was occupied by the Nazis, who they didn't see coming because...
And what's amazing about it is that Churchill actually takes office as the new prime minister on the day that the Germans launched their attack into the West, into France. So the very day that the British soldiers come under attack on mainland Europe is the day he takes office. I mean, I cannot imagine a tougher challenge than that.
They'd been expecting the Germans. Hitler wanted to make Britain German, to match its royal family, but they are...
He wanted to make Britain German to match its royal family. Yes, the British royal family is heavily German through multiple generations. 100% true.
RAF held Hitler's forces back in amazing dogfights in the sky that were done by aeroplanes, not actual flying dogs, which sadly science still hasn't invented yet. This was the Battle of Britain. It seems amazing that these young men could fly and fight so well. Although when you look, you'll see the planes had tiny targets and crosses drawn on the side, which made them easier to hit. But planes weren't only used in dogfights. The Germans changed tactics. Instead of attacking planes, which could move out of the way, they attacked the ground, which couldn't, in something called the Blitz.
Preceded by a shower of flares, German bombers rained fire and high explosive bombs in their most savage attack on London.
Hitler's pilots started dropping bombs. sort of aeroplane poos, and people like to have...
Airplane poos. Wow. You know, one of the things that we as Americans will never be able to fully relate to, I don't think, is what it was like to be that close to your enemy, right? Because like when we fought World War II, yeah, the Japanese hit us in Hawaii, but Hawaii was a territory and it's 5 hours away by flying, even from Los Angeles. So it's still kind of out there, right? Our mainland was never really threatened. And so we didn't know what it was like to worry about sending our kids out of the city so they wouldn't be killed by a bombing raid. Not just the British, but of course the folks in France and Germany and Russia and other places who were really firsthand experiencing this war.
Hide from them. They built big tin shelters in their gardens or ran down the nearest tube station without a ticket or a valid Oyster card. Countless houses were reduced to big...
Without a valid Oyster card. They did go down in the tube stations. Oyster card is something you can get to tap in and out. You can load it with money.
Piles of bricks and wood, which is sort of what houses are anyway, but in a different order. Despite this, thanks to the plucky British spirit, people weren't totally down in the dumps, even if they lived in one. People sang songs during World War II to keep their spirits up, didn't they? How loud did they have to sing to be heard over the bombs?
Well, especially as they would have sometimes been in underground stations, sheltering from the bombs. It would have been loud in the underground station, the singing, if everybody was singing together, but it's true, you wouldn't have been heard much.
I wonder if when they sang, they used to time their singing with the explosions. That would be a fun thing to do.
Difficult. Very difficult to time it. It's quite random, the falling of bombs.
In the war...
He's just rolling with it. He's like it's no big deal.
Lots of songs taking the piss out of Hitler, weren't there? How come they don't sing those sorts of songs anymore?
Well, he's not around anymore, so it's not so amusing.
Where is he?
Where is he?
He's dead.
Yes.
Oh, right, so it'd be disrespectful to...
Well, not so much
ill of him.
disrespectful as pointless, really.
Pointless.
A bit pointless.
Yeah. A lot of singing was needed because even when the Blitz ended, the war was far from over. There were many huge battles to come, most of which will never be forgotten because they've since been converted into blockbuster movies. How was it we beat the Germans at Dunkirk in War II, but still didn't win the whole war?
Well, first of all, I think we've got to stop calling it War II. I mean, it's the Second World War if you're American, and you have to have it this way, it's World War II. But you know, that's the language we tend to use. But in terms of Dunkirk, I think that's the wrong way round. We actually lose at Dunkirk.
We lost at Dunkirk?
We lost at Dunkirk. I mean,
don't think so.
I don't think so.
It turns out Dunkirk was a huge disaster. Like most sequels, War II was proving less fun than War I. What made the war harder was that we didn't know what the Germans were planning, because they said it in a sort of code language known as German.
A code language known as German.
It took a team of British boffins using a magic typewriter called the Enigma machine literally loads of time to crack it, but crack it they did. And with Germany's secrets twatted wide open, Britain and its allies were able to organise D-Day and invade France, but in a nice way. In grueling and exciting scenes like these,
Call of Duty 2.
Expertly depicted in the pulse-quickening video game Call of Duty 2, soldiers scrambled out of their boats, looking for power-ups and health kits, terrified...
Looking for power-ups and health kits. If only it were so easy.
Every second that a Nazi bullet might kill them, forcing them to respawn several feet away and be delayed by a number of seconds. Eventually the British won, and immediately there was widespread jubilation and people dancing about in black and white and getting off with people who were almost certainly dead now. A new, hopeful era had dawned, an era which 41 years later included the BBC painting and decorating television sitcom Brushstroke.
So we're going to wrap it up right there. I just wanted to go through World War I and World War II. If you want to see me react to more of her stuff, use the comment section below. Let me know if there's a specific one of her videos, a specific part of history that she covers that you think is especially entertaining, that would be fun to check out. And like I said, I'll put the link in the description to this original video. This is part of a much bigger series, Cunk on Britain. She's got, I think, Cunk on Earth, and there's some other ones too that are all really, really funny. So if you like that style of humor, I highly recommend you check it out. Thanks for watching.